They say the bones still rise when the river runs low. When the drought comes to that valley, the mud pulls back just far enough to show pale shapes beneath the silt. Finger bones clasped together like they were praying. But they weren't praying. They were holding each other down. The townspeople call it the dry season curse, though no one says the name of the family buried beneath. The records were sealed after the fire, after the flood, after the disappearances that came before both. But the ground remembers what people try to forget. And every few years, when the sun burns away the mist and the river shrinks to a thread, the bones return, smaller each time, thinner, softer, as if even in death the bloodline was dissolving. It began, or maybe ended, in 1912, when a child was born in a house that no longer stands. The birth was never recorded. The midwife who attended it left town the next morning and never spoke again. The child's mother, a girl of 16, died within the week, and the man who called himself her husband disappeared into the hills before the body was cold. When the neighbors came to bury her, they found 2 cribs in the bedroom, one empty, one soaked through. For years afterward, people said they could hear an infant crying from beneath the floorboards when the house was quiet. Others swore they saw a boy in the woods at dusk, pale, naked, moving wrong, too fast and too silent to be human. When the house finally burned in 1927, the sheriff declared it an accident. But no one believed that. The town never spoke of it again, though they all knew whose land it had been. And yet, 100 years later, the blood still answers to that name. Every few generations, a child is born who looks like no one in the family. The same grey eyes, the same high, sharp cheekbones, the same way of staring through people, like they're windows, and he can see what's waiting on the other side. That's how they know it's begun again. So when the newest baby came, when his skin turned the color of river mud, and his breath rattled like stones underwater, the midwife didn't speak a word. She only asked one question. Do you want him to live? Which city are you watching from? And what time is it right now? The answer the mother gave was never written down. But by the next morning, the baby was gone, and so was she. The midwife told the sheriff that the child had been taken by relatives upstate, kin of the father, though no one in town ever saw them arrive or leave. But a letter surfaced years later, written in a trembling hand and never sent, found sealed inside the midwife's Bible after her death. It said only, "The mark returned. The child bears it. I did what they asked of me. God forgive me." No one knows what mark she meant. But the coroner who handled the mother's body noted a thin ring of bruising around her throat. Not from hands, but something smoother, tighter. A cord maybe, or something like a cord. When genealogists later traced the family's history, long after the land was abandoned and the house was just a foundation of charred stone, they found something that made even the state archivist pause. From 1814 to 1899, every recorded marriage in that bloodline occurred between cousins. First cousins, second cousins, sometimes uncle to niece. The local priest wrote in one of his letters that the family believed themselves chosen, set apart by providence, and that the blood was to remain pure and undiluted. But what they called purity, the rest of the valley called sickness, children born blind, infants with fused fingers, faces too symmetrical, too still, a stillness that looked like silence, but wasn't. They worshipped differently, too. Not in church, but underground, literally, during the drought of 1848, when the wells ran dry. Workers found a chamber beneath the property, carved stone walls lined with family names, initials, and birth years that didn't match the graves above. Some of the names repeated every few decades, as though the same person was born again and again. And there were drawings, crude, scratched with charcoal, a circle of figures standing around what looked like a pool of water. In the middle, something rising from it. After that, the workers sealed the chamber and left. Within weeks, the family vanished from the census for almost a decade. Then they reappeared. Same name, same faces, same property. As if nothing had ever happened. When the river first ran dry in 1912, that's when the bones began to surface. That's when the curse started taking shape in photographs, and not just stories. But the strangest part came a century later, when one of their descendants mailed a DNA test to a company in California. And what came back wasn't a family tree, it was a warning. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday, plain white. No return address except a barcode and the logo of the testing company. The man who ordered it, we'll call him Daniel, said he only wanted to know where he came from. He'd grown up hearing whispers about the River family, about strange photographs kept locked away, about eyes that looked too ancient for a young face. He thought a DNA test might give him an answer science could name. But science doesn't name what it can't classify. When the email came back, it didn't show the bright, colored map he expected, the little pie chart with neat lines tracing ancestry to places with flags and borders. Instead, the page was gray, and in the center, one sentence appeared in red. Genetic markers not found in reference database. He refreshed the page. The message stayed. A few minutes later, the company emailed again, not automated this time. A researcher wanted to speak. In person. They met over video call. The man on the other end looked uneasy, like he'd been awake too long. He kept glancing off screen, as though someone else was in the room, listening. He said Daniel's DNA sample showed patterns he'd only seen once before. In a confidential government study from the 1980s, a case connected to a rural family who displayed what the report called multi-generational genetic collapse. The chromosomes, the man said, had folded in on themselves, not mutated, folded like something trying to return to its origin. Then he asked Daniel if he'd ever experienced sleep paralysis, if he'd ever woken up to the sound of rushing water, if he'd ever found mud on his sheets in the morning. The call ended abruptly. The researcher's profile vanished from the company website within hours. And when Daniel tried to re-access his results, the account no longer existed. But the damage was done. He had already downloaded the data, raw strings of genetic code, labeled with timestamps and coordinates. One of those coordinates pointed directly to the old family property by the river. He drove there that same night. Locals said they saw his headlights vanish down the dirt road around midnight. They said they heard the engine stall. And then, something else. A sound like water moving underground, though the riverbed was bone dry. By morning, his car was found abandoned. Driver's side door open, engine cold. No footprints leading away. Only a trail of wet silt that began at the driver's seat and disappeared into the trees. When Daniel disappeared, there was no search party, not officially. His family didn't call the police. They said he'd gone traveling, that he needed time away. But one of his friends, a photojournalist named Claire, didn't believe that. She'd been helping him trace the family line, digging through archives, libraries, old courthouse ledgers that still smelled of smoke. 2 weeks after he vanished, a padded envelope arrived at her apartment. No return name, no postage marks, just the initials DM scrawled in pencil. Inside was a small stack of photographs. Real film, the kind that leaves a faint chemical scent on your fingers. The first few were unremarkable, black and white portraits of people in plain clothes, faces too still, eyes glassy in the old-fashioned way. But the further she flipped, the stranger they became. In one, a child stood ankle, deep in water inside what looked like a basement. His reflection was wrong, slightly delayed, as though the water itself was watching him back. In another, a man posed beside a riverbank at dusk. Behind him, the shape of a hand pressed up from beneath the mud, 5 fingers. Too long, too thin. At the bottom of the stack was a letter, typed on yellowed paper. It wasn't signed, but the date read June 17, 1912. The same summer the house burned. They told us to bury them deep. But the ground keeps breathing. The water will not stay still. If you read this, do not follow the river. It knows our names. Claire took the photos to a university archivist in Raleigh, someone who specialized in early 20th century photography. The man studied the negatives under magnification, and after a long pause, he said something she would never forget. These aren't composites. There's no evidence of trick exposure. Whatever's in these was there when the photograph was taken. That night, she uploaded the images to a secure cloud folder, and within an hour, her account was locked. An alert message appeared. These files are under federal review. Access restricted. By morning, the photos were gone, her computer wiped. But one image had already circulated, a backup auto saved to her phone. It showed a stone doorway half, buried beneath the riverbank, a sigil carved into the arch. Locals later confirmed what it was, the entrance to the sealed chamber discovered in 1848, and when investigators broke it open again in 2019, they found something that should not have been there at all. Something that proved Daniel never left. The excavation was quiet, almost reverent. 3 archaeologists, 2 deputies, and 1 forensic observer stood in a crescent around the mouth of the chamber. The river had receded again that summer, leaving the black stone arch exposed like a wound reopening. They expected bones, artifacts, maybe old ritual objects from a family cult that had long collapsed into rumor. But what they found inside was not ruin. It was preservation. The air was dry, sealed off from the world above for nearly 2 centuries. The walls were covered in carvings, hundreds of names repeating in a spiral pattern that narrowed as it descended into the floor. Each ring of names ended with the same initials, DM. In the center stood a table of river stone. Upon it, a single glass jar. Inside the jar floated something pale and soft, tissue suspended in amber fluid. When they tested it later, it wasn't animal, and it wasn't fully human. The DNA matched Daniel's. Only half of it, though. The other half was identical to a sample extracted from a preserved bloodstain found on the chamber wall, dated roughly 1890. That meant Daniel shared genetic material, not with a descendant, but with an ancestor separated by over 100 years, and worse, the sequences were identical. No mutation, no drift. Perfect replication, base for base. As if the blood had not evolved at all, as if time itself hadn't touched it. The lead geneticist on the case wrote that the sample contained stabilized DNA loops consistent with autogenous cloning, self-breeding, a body reconstituting its own bloodline. The deeper they went, the more the chamber began to breathe. Literally, moisture on the walls pulsed with a faint rhythm, expanding and contracting every few seconds. The sound was like a slow inhale beneath the stone. One deputy saw he heard whispering from the dark beyond the carvings. Another fainted outright. When the lights flickered, the jar cracked, The fluid leaked across the table, tracing the etched spiral of names. Where it touched the grooves, the carvings darkened, bleeding outward like ink into paper. By dawn, the team sealed the chamber again. The official report listed the find as anomalous remains, pending verification. But the files were classified within a week, and the local sheriff's office received a cease order from the Department of Health and Human Services. 3 of the 6 who entered the chamber later reported the same recurring dream, standing waist deep in a river, holding hands with someone who looked exactly like themselves. And when they woke, their fingernails were packed with silt. Officially, the discovery never happened. Within a week, the excavation site was fenced off with unmarked trucks and government seals. The press release said the ground was unstable, a public safety concern. But the residents who lived near the river watched new men arrive in white suits, carrying containers marked biohazard level 4. They worked only at night. By the end of the month, the river was redirected. The chamber, once again, was drowned. But not before one of the archaeologists, Dr. Lorna Hale, smuggled out a single vial of the leaked fluid. She mailed it to a genetic pathology lab in Maryland under a false name, attaching a note that read simply, "Tell me if it's human." 3 days later, the lab burned. The fire began in the cold storage wing, spreading so fast the alarms failed to trigger. No samples were ever recovered. Dr. Hale disappeared soon after. Her car found abandoned beside a reservoir. Inside was a single Polaroid, a newborn with slate-colored eyes and a thin ring of bruising around its neck. The photo was dated 2024. Investigators traced the image to a hospital 2 states away. The infant's mother, a woman named Mara, 26, claimed she didn't know who the father was. But her surname matched the same family that once lived by the river. Mara's medical file listed unusual hematologic properties. Her blood clotted too quickly, regenerating faster than normal. Nurses said she healed overnight from a C-section scar. One doctor, off record, said her blood seemed rehearsed, as if it already knew what to do. When social workers visited her home weeks later, she and the baby were gone. Only the crib remained, its sheets damp, streaked with a faint brown residue that smelled of algae. By then, the government had scrubbed every trace of the River family from public records. Property deeds vanished. Census lines redacted. The original photographs Claire found were seized under the National Public Health Act. But stories leaked like water through earth. A truck driver who passed through the valley claimed he saw a woman walking barefoot along the dry riverbed at dusk, carrying a child wrapped in black cloth. He said she was humming, a low, rhythmic tone that made the air feel heavy. When she turned toward his headlights, he swore her eyes reflected silver, not white. When the driver blinked, she was gone. Only footprints remained, leading straight into the river's center, where no water flowed, yet the ground was wet. And 2 nights later, the drought broke. Rain fell for 9 straight days. The valley flooded again. When the rain began, the locals said it sounded wrong. Not like water hitting earth, but like something breathing. Long, slow exhalations through the soil, as if the valley itself was waking after a century of sleep. On the 3rd night, the river returned. But it didn't flow from the mountains as before. It welled up from below, from cracks in the dry riverbed, bubbling black at first, then clear, then red. Fish came up dead, their scales sloughed away as if peeled by unseen hands. The current carried fragments of wood, glass, and bone, too human to be mistaken for debris. By dawn, the flood had reached the old foundations of the river house. There was no structure left, only stone outlines half swallowed by mud. But then the current shifted, and a wall of silt collapsed to reveal the same carved arch that had been buried and sealed so many times before. This time, the water didn't drown it. It avoided it, splitting cleanly around the entrance, as though obeying something older than gravity. At 7:42 that morning, a farmer filmed the flood from his property a mile away. In the footage, the river bends unnaturally, curving around the site before continuing its course. For a few seconds, a figure can be seen standing in the shallows, not wading, standing on the surface. The video lasts only 8 seconds before cutting to static, but the final frame, magnified later by investigators, shows two silhouettes, a woman, barefoot, holding a child. When federal response teams arrived, they reported an unidentified biological event. Dozens of bodies from the original burial ground had surfaced intact. Skin preserved as if embalmed by the floodwater, their faces were smooth, ageless, and their eyes, every one of them, had turned the same metallic gray as the newborn in the Polaroid. Autopsies were inconclusive. The tissues resisted decomposition. The blood, when exposed to air, thickened instantly, hardening into a clear, glass-like resin. The lead pathologist noted that the DNA in every corpse matched the same signature, a pattern previously flagged in Daniel's test file. The report's final line read, "No genetic variants detected. All samples originate from a single repeating genome. Every generation had been the same being, reborn through its own blood, again and again. The family hadn't been breeding themselves into extinction. They had been breeding themselves into immortality. And now the river was bringing them back." When the flood reached the town, it didn't come as a wave. It crept. First through the drainage ditches, then through the church cellar, then beneath the floorboards of houses that hadn't seen water in decades. It carried no smell of decay, no debris, just that faint metallic tang of something too clean to be natural. At dawn, the mayor declared a state of emergency, but the phones had already gone dead, and the power grid flickered out one line at a time. By midday, the entire valley was without signal. Satellite imagery showed nothing but a grey mist curling above the water. Those who tried to flee spoke later, if they spoke at all, of hearing voices over the rain. Not screams, not prayers. Just the repetition of a single phrase in a language no one recognized. Children repeated it in their sleep. Elderly residents hummed it under their breath without realizing. When the flood reached the town square, it stopped rising. The water stood still, perfectly level, reflecting the sky like glass. And beneath that mirrored surface, people said they could see faces. Not floating, but pressed upward, as if waiting for the right moment to surface. By nightfall, the first sickness began, rashes shaped like concentric rings, eyes clouding to a silver sheen. Blood tests showed cells reproducing without division, folding inward like a flower closing on itself. Hospitals filled overnight, then emptied again when the patient simply vanished. The last radio transmission came from the sheriff's office. "It's not drowning. It's calling. The water's calling us back." When rescue teams entered the valley 2 weeks later, they found no bodies, no buildings, no animals, just still water stretching from ridge to ridge. The floodline formed a perfect circle, nearly 10 miles across, as though drawn by compass. Core samples taken from the center showed something no geologist could explain. The soil layers were reversed. Ancient sediment on top, fresh clay beneath, as if time had folded back on itself. Government records now list the site as a hydrological anomaly. It's fenced off, uninhabitable, But satellites continue to pick up faint electromagnetic activity beneath the surface. Rhythmic, pulsing, like a heartbeat buried under mud. And every year, on the same date the flood began, the water level rises by exactly 1 inch. No rain, no runoff, just rising. Somewhere beneath that glassy surface, something is still growing. Something that has always known how to return. They found her 3 months later, 50 miles from the flood zone. She was walking along the shoulder of an empty highway. Barefoot, clothes soaked though no rain had fallen in weeks. Her hands were folded around something wrapped in black cloth. When the trooper stopped to help her, she said only one thing before collapsing. "The river is inside now." She was taken to stay. Agnes Hospital in Virginia under a false name. No records exist of her admission. But nurses from that ward still whisper about the woman who bled clear. They said her pulse didn't beat. It shimmered. A slow wave that rippled beneath her skin like light through shallow water. When asked about the child she was carrying, she smiled faintly and said, "He never cries. He listens." That night, she vanished from her room. The security footage froze for 7 minutes, and when the cameras resumed, her bed was empty. The sheets were damp. The window was open. On the windowsill, faint footprints. 2 adult, 1 small. Both trailed mud. Months later, hikers reported seeing a boy near the Blue Ridge line. Pale skin, gray eyes. Standing by a creek that shouldn't have been there. They said he was building something with stones, perfectly circular, humming under his breath. When they called out to him, he turned, smiled, and said, "The water remembers you too." After that, the sighting spread. Streams appeared where there had been dry ground. Wells filled themselves overnight. In towns hundreds of miles apart, the same symbol began to appear, carved into tree bark, burned into concrete, drawn on fogged windows, a spiral narrowing inward. Geologists dismissed it as coincidence. Theologists called it prophecy. But those who had touched the floodwater, the rescuers, the surveyors, even the ones who only carried samples, began to show the same symptoms. Eyes clouding to silver. Skin damp in rooms without humidity. Dreams filled with rushing water and voices whispering from beneath the floorboards. One of them, before vanishing, left a message scrawled in a motel Bible. It wasn't a curse. It was a memory trying to return to flesh. Now, a century after the first bones rose, the river is moving again. Not the same river. It's in the veins of those who survived it. In the groundwater. In the rain. No one speaks the family's name anymore. The government erased it. The records sealed forever. But the bloodline doesn't need a name. It has the earth. It has the water. And somewhere, beneath all of it, it's still humming. The same lullaby, the same promise whispered since 1842. The blood remembers. Then silence. Then the sound of water, moving closer.